He was called Pastor Raymond Hale, though few ever spoke his name without that uneasy pause that follows when reverence collides with suspicion. In the small town of Glen Ridge, Tennessee, his church stood like a fortress of light, a massive modern temple built from the offerings of those who trusted him. Hale's voice carried through the town like scripture itself, smooth and assured, a balm for the lonely and the lost. He preached about redemption, about how God's grace could wash away anything, addiction, infidelity, despair. But what he never said from the pulpit was that he believed himself above the very sins he condemned. To him, forgiveness wasn't a gift to be given freely. It was a tool, one he used to bend others until they broke. When Hale arrived in Glen Ridge in 2007, the church was dying. Attendance had dwindled to a few dozen. The roof leaked. The choir was a ghost of its former glory. Within months, Hale transformed it. He started live streaming sermons, building a charismatic image online, the shepherd of second chances. Donations poured in from across the South. Within 3 years, he had raised nearly $3 million. He preached prosperity. He said God rewards those who give, and he kept meticulous records of every contribution, every seed of faith planted. His sermons grew more theatrical: smoke machines, LED lights, choirs singing pop hymns. And as the crowd grew, so did his ego. By 2012, he'd built a private ministry school and a retreat center on the edge of town. Officially, it was a sanctuary for prayer and healing. Unofficially, it became Hale's kingdom, a place where he controlled everything: who could visit, who could leave, and who could speak. It started with whispers. Women who volunteered at the church spoke of late-night counseling sessions. A few left suddenly, no explanation. One girl, barely 19, returned home after a weekend retreat and refused to talk about what happened. Another woman, a single mother, vanished entirely. Her car was found near the edge of the retreat property, keys still in the ignition. Hale said she'd run off to find herself. For years, no one questioned him. In Glen Ridge, to doubt Pastor Hale was to doubt God, and he knew it. Behind the pulpit, he smiled and promised salvation. Behind closed doors, he preyed on fear and faith alike. He targeted those who were already broken: addicts trying to recover, women escaping abusive marriages, young men struggling to find direction. He offered them housing at the retreat, therapy sessions, spiritual cleansing. But in return, he demanded loyalty, absolute and unquestioning. He recorded confessions. He made them sign non-disclosure agreements. He told them that revealing what happened in spiritual privacy would curse them and their families. Then came Sarah Collins. Sarah had been part of Hale's congregation for 6 years. She'd lost her husband in a car crash, left with 2 children and mounting debt. Hale took her in, gave her a job managing donations. She saw everything: the money, the false ledgers, the cash envelopes that disappeared into his office safe. In 2016, Hale called her to his private quarters at the retreat. He told her that God had chosen her for a higher purpose, that she was meant to be his vessel of divine comfort. When she refused, he grew cold. Within a week, she was removed from her position, publicly shamed from the pulpit for stealing church funds. Her reputation collapsed overnight, but Sarah didn't vanish. She began collecting evidence: copies of financial records, screenshots of Hale's messages, testimonies from former staff who had fled the retreat. Over a year, she built a file thick enough to crush the facade he had crafted. In early 2018, she handed it to Detective Carla James of the Glen Ridge Sheriff's Department. James had heard rumors before, but this: bank statements showing transfers to offshore accounts, anonymous reports of assault, recordings of Hale coercing confessions. It was damning. Still, she knew it wouldn't be easy. Hale's influence stretched beyond the church. The mayor was a deacon. The police chief's wife sang in the choir. When word spread that investigators were sniffing around, Hale called it spiritual warfare. His followers doubled down, fasting and praying to protect their pastor. Then the retreat burned. It was a cold February night. Flames devoured the main building, and by dawn, 3 people were dead. 2 staff members, and 1 unidentified body found in Hale's private quarters. The town grieved. Hale called it a test of faith and claimed the fire was an attack by satanic forces. Donations surged again, but when forensic investigators examined the remains, they discovered something Hale couldn't explain. The 3rd body wasn't his. He had vanished. For months, the church continued without him, led by loyal elders who insisted he'd gone into hiding to pray in the wilderness. But Detective James wasn't convinced. She followed the money trail, one that led from Glenridge to a series of wire transfers made from a hotel room in Belize. And in June 2018, local police there arrested a man using a forged passport under the name Richard Hayes. It was Hale. When extradited back to the U.S., he smiled for the cameras. He told reporters that he was being persecuted for his faith, that everything he did was for the kingdom. But in court, the mask slipped. The prosecution presented more than 40 witnesses, women and men who described the manipulation, the coercion, the psychological torment. They spoke of nights where Hale claimed to cast out demons, forcing them to confess sins that weren't theirs, to strip away impurity through ritual humiliation. And then there were the finances. Nearly $5 million in donations unaccounted for, funneled through shell companies and personal accounts. The retreat fire, investigators discovered, had been intentionally set. Gasoline residue beneath the floorboards, ignition points traced to electrical outlets. The jury took just 7 hours. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole on charges of sexual assault, arson, and fraud. As the verdict was read, Hale lifted his hands toward the ceiling and began to pray aloud, eyes closed, whispering, "The shepherd never dies." From his cell in the Tennessee State Penitentiary, he began writing letters to his old congregation, to his victims, to anyone who would listen. He claimed he'd been betrayed by false prophets and that God would soon reveal the truth. Some still believed him. A small group of loyalists continued meeting every Sunday, reading his letters aloud like scripture. In Glenridge, the church still stands. The new pastor avoids speaking Hale's name, but sometimes, when the evening light hits the stained glass just right, the shadows that crawl along the pews seem almost to take shape. A tall figure with outstretched hands, a voice murmuring promises of grace and fire, and every now and then a letter still arrives. Stamped from prison, signed with shaky penmanship. "Your shepherd still watches." The town of Hollow Springs sat forgotten on the map. A cluster of rust-colored rooftops pressed against the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place where nothing much happened except the slow erosion of hope. When Elias Ward arrived there in 2004, he looked like an answer to a question no one had dared to ask. He wasn't like the others who had tried to preach salvation to the poor. He didn't wear suits or wave Bibles in the street. He came in boots and denim, with a weathered face and a voice so calm it made people lean in to hear him. He told them he wasn't a pastor, he was a prophet, sent, he said, to rebuild faith from the ashes of the old world. At first people laughed. Then they listened. Hollow Springs was dying. The mine had shut down years earlier. Unemployment was rampant, drug use worse. The town's only church, a white clapboard chapel, had closed when the roof caved in during a storm. Elias reopened it with his own hands, or so it seemed. In truth, he had help. Men and women who followed him from town to town, calling him the Voice. Within weeks, the chapel was filled every night. He preached that God no longer lived in the city churches or on television screens. He had retreated to the small towns, to the forgotten corners of America where true faith still flickered. His sermons were quiet at first, almost hypnotic, weaving guilt and hope together like barbed wire and silk. Then came the miracles. A woman claimed her tumor had vanished after Elias prayed over her. A blind man said he could see faint light. Word spread fast, and within months, people were driving in from neighboring states to see the prophet of Hollow Springs. The offerings piled high, envelopes stuffed with cash, jewelry, even deeds to land. Elias told them that faith demanded sacrifice. and those who gave would be shielded when the cleansing came. He bought more land, 200 acres outside town. There, he built what he called the sanctuary, a self-sustaining commune where only the truly faithful could live. Dozens moved in. They built cabins, planted crops, and surrendered their bank accounts. Every evening, Elias would stand beneath a wooden cross carved into the hillside and preach about purity before the fire. But the fire, it turned out, was already burning. Those inside the sanctuary lived under strict rules. No alcohol, no television, no contact with outsiders without Elias's permission. Couples were told to sleep separately unless granted spiritual union. Children were homeschooled by Elias's chosen teachers, mostly women who never left the compound. He told his followers that the world beyond the gates was poisoned, that government agents and demons worked together to destroy the righteous. He claimed to receive visions at night, messages from God about who was unclean. Those he named were forced into isolation, fasting, prayer, and purification. For some, purification meant being locked in a shed for days. For others, it meant standing in freezing water while reciting scripture until they collapsed. No one questioned him, until Miriam Hayes disappeared. Miriam was 19, the daughter of one of Elias's earliest followers. She had grown up inside the sanctuary, quiet, obedient, devout. But according to whispers among the younger members, Elias had begun calling her to his cabin at night for private revelation sessions. When she didn't appear one morning, her mother asked questions, and the next day, she was gone too. Elias told the congregation that they had been taken by God to be purified. He warned that doubt would bring punishment. But something in the air shifted. A few of the older members began sneaking letters to the outside world. One reached the local sheriff, who passed it to the state police. It described confinement, forced labor, sexual abuse, and disappearances. Investigators tried to approach the compound, but Elias's followers blocked the gates, unarmed yet unmoving, chanting hymns in unison. For a while, authorities could do nothing. Then in November 2012, a young boy escaped, 12 years old, barefoot, shivering. He walked 6 miles to a gas station and told the clerk that the prophet had buried the light. Deputies found him delirious, covered in welts and burns. He said he'd been punished for speaking to his dead sister's photograph. When police raided the sanctuary days later, Elias greeted them calmly. He said they were trespassing on holy land. Behind him, hundreds of followers stood silently, eyes vacant. Inside the cabins, investigators found a dozen purification sheds, restraints bolted to the floors, and documents listing each member's sins. They also found a shallow grave behind Elias's cabin. DNA confirmed it was Miriam Hayes. Her mother was never found. Elias was arrested without resistance. During interrogation, he smiled, saying that Miriam's death was a test of her vessel. He insisted he'd been chosen by God to cleanse the impure before the world's end. When asked why he buried her, he said, because her flesh had already been forgiven. At his trial, dozens of former followers testified. They described psychological manipulation, starvation, ritual humiliation. One man said Elias convinced him to sign over his house, then exiled him for questioning a sermon. Another said he was forced to beat his own son to drive out weakness. But even in court, Elias retained his following. Dozens of believers filled the benches, some weeping, others glaring at the prosecutor. They claimed the trial was persecution, that Elias's imprisonment would unleash divine wrath. The prosecution showed the world what had really happened in Hollow Springs. $8. 2 million stolen from congregants, at least 3 confirmed deaths, and evidence of mass graves under construction. Elias was sentenced to life without parole for murder, fraud, and multiple counts of assault. When the verdict was read, he stood, raised his arms, and said, "The world will remember my name when the fire comes." And in a way it did. Even now, years later, people drive out to the ruins of the sanctuary. The cabins are gone, burned to ash after a lightning strike in 2018. Locals say on quiet nights, you can still hear chanting through the trees, not ghostly, but recorded from the old loudspeakers that somehow keep working, looping the same message Elias used to repeat. Faith without pain is not faith at all. And deep beneath the soil where the grave markers once stood, the earth still gives off a faint heat, as if it remembers what it was promised. They called him Father Gabriel Stokes, not the one from the Bible, but a man who believed he could speak straight to heaven through music. Before the scandal, before the graves, his church was alive with sound, a massive choir that filled the rafters every Sunday in the small Louisiana town of Belmere. His voice, deep and thunderous, could make grown men cry. Parishioners swore that when he sang, something sacred moved through them, something that healed. For over a decade, Father Gabriel built a kingdom on that sound. The Church of the Living Spirit became famous across the South. Its choir toured cities, recorded gospel albums, even appeared on morning television. Gabriel said the music wasn't entertainment, it was divine resonance. He preached that each human soul had a frequency, and when tuned to God's vibration, it could purge sin, illness, and death itself. The congregation believed him. They gave money freely, built him a recording studio, a new chapel, a mansion behind the church. But somewhere between the sermons and the spotlight, Gabriel stopped hearing the music of God and started listening only to his own. The first signs came quietly. Choir members would vanish from the lineup without explanation. He said they'd moved away or been called home. No one questioned it. The choir was large and turnover was common. Then a local woman named Rachel Devereaux came forward. Rachel had been one of Gabriel's star sopranos, radiant, devout, and gifted. After she lost her father, she began staying late at the church, singing with Gabriel after hours. She told her sister she felt a strange pull when he prayed over her. Months later, she stopped returning calls. Her disappearance didn't make headlines. People assumed she'd joined a touring choir or taken a mission trip. Gabriel's services went on as usual. Then a janitor cleaning out the church basement found something odd. A locked freezer behind the old baptismal tank. When he opened it, he found animal bones, hundreds of them, some clearly not animal. He went straight to the police. Detectives arrived quietly one night after service, searching the basement, then the storage shed behind Gabriel's mansion. What they found there wasn't just evidence. It was ritual. Photographs lined the walls, choir members arranged in circles, eyes closed, hands bound. Not in fear but reverence. Audio recordings labeled purification sessions. Each file was dated, the same dates as the disappearances. The tapes contained hours of low, rhythmic chanting, then screams, then silence followed by Gabriel's voice saying, "The note is pure." When confronted, Gabriel smiled. He told investigators they didn't understand, that the people in the recordings had offered themselves to become harmony. He described a belief system of his own creation, that when the human voice dies in devotion, its echo joins heaven. They didn't believe him until they found the graves. Behind his mansion was a small, manicured garden filled with white lilies. Beneath them were 22 bodies, former choir members, each buried with their vocal cords surgically removed. At the trial, Gabriel acted not like a man facing life in prison, but like a preacher still giving a sermon. He quoted scripture, smiled at the jury, even sang hymns. His defense argued insanity, that he believed he was saving souls through divine frequency therapy. But the evidence was irrefutable. Dozens of recordings, bank statements showing donations funneled into surgical equipment and soundproofing materials, and testimonies from survivors, those who'd fled before the final ritual. One woman described how Gabriel forced them into isolation chambers for vocal fasting, making them sing until they lost consciousness. He said it was the sound of sin leaving the body. Another recalled how he'd anoint their throats with oil, whispering that if their voice cracked, their spirit was weak. When the verdict came, guilty on 22 counts of murder, Gabriel didn't flinch. He just began humming softly as they led him away. The melody was one his choir had sung countless times. Swing low, sweet chariot. In prison he kept singing, Guards said he never spoke except in song. Inmates reported strange humming through the vents at night like a distant chorus. 2 years into his sentence, his cellmate was found dead. No signs of violence, just a look of frozen ecstasy and his throat covered in oil. When they checked Gabriel's cell, he was gone. The cameras showed nothing, just flickering static for 17 minutes. Then when the feed returned, the cell was empty. The only thing left was a small recorder on the bed, still playing. The last words captured on the tape were whispered, almost tender. "The choir is complete now." A week later, residents near Belmere reported hearing faint singing drifting over the old church ruins. Not loud, not human, just enough to make the wind vibrate through the trees in perfect pitch. Locals call it the choir of bones. And sometimes, when the night is still enough, the sound seems to call your name. The town of Haverly was small enough that everyone knew when the church bells rang, even if they didn't attend the service. It was the kind of place where time moved slow, and the loudest sound on a Sunday was the echo of hymns over quiet streets. When Reverend Jonah Kell took the pulpit at St. Mark's, people said he brought life back to the place. His sermons were passionate, his laughter warm, and his message simple. Forgiveness heals all. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a presence. He knew everyone's name, their children's birthdays, their debts, their addictions. He didn't condemn them for it, not at first. He'd look them in the eye and tell them that God saw them, loved them, and wanted them to let go of their burdens. It wasn't long before the congregation doubled, then tripled. The donations box overflowed. People who had stopped believing began to believe again. But what no one realized was that forgiveness was also Jonah Kell's favorite weapon. He came from nothing, grew up in foster care, bounced between families, found faith behind bars after a string of petty thefts in his teens. The story was perfect for the pulpit, redemption through pain, and it sold well. By the time he arrived in Haverly, he was in his 40s, clean-cut, charming, carrying a leather Bible that looked older than him. He began recording his sermons, streaming them online. The money poured in, donations from across the country, people moved by his message of grace. But his real influence was local. He started the Redemption Circle, a private ministry for broken souls, men and women seeking forgiveness for deep personal sins. Admission was by invitation only. The meetings were held in the church basement behind locked doors. Members were told that what happened inside was sacred and secret, that their confessions were recorded only so God could hear them. But Jonah kept the tapes. One by one he gathered their secrets, affairs, addictions, hidden crimes. He told them they were forgiven, then used their confessions to control them. Some he blackmailed for money, others he manipulated into acts of faith, loans, favors, silence. Those who resisted were reminded that the church's reputation was fragile, and so were their souls. Still, no one spoke out. Not until the night of April 17th, when a fire broke out at St. Mark's. The sanctuary burned fast, the old wood crackling like kindling. By the time firefighters arrived, the steeple had collapsed. 3 people were found dead inside, 2 men and 1 woman, all members of the Redemption Circle. Their bodies were discovered in a semicircle near the pulpit, hands clasped, eyes closed. At first, investigators thought they had died trying to save the church. But when the autopsy results came back, the truth shifted. None of them had smoke in their lungs. They were already dead before the fire started. All 3 had been poisoned. When detectives questioned Reverend Kell, he wept. He said they had gathered for prayer that night, that he'd stepped out to make a call, and when he returned, the church was in flames. He spoke of grief, of loss, of faith under trial. But when they searched the rubble, they found something buried beneath the floorboards, a metal lockbox, half melted. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, labeled by name and date. Recordings of confessions, dozens of them. They also found a ledger, lists of donations and penance payments, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, all funneled through shell accounts linked to Kell's personal fund. When confronted, his composure cracked. He insisted the tapes were part of a spiritual exercise, that the money was used to help struggling members. But the deeper investigators dug, the darker it got. On one tape, the voice of the deceased woman could be heard. She confessed to infidelity and begged forgiveness. Kell's voice followed, calm and deliberate. Forgiveness requires release. Sometimes the body must let go before the soul can rise. The sound of pouring liquid followed, then silence. When the prosecution played the tape in court, the room froze. It became clear that Kell's redemption circle wasn't just a ministry, it was an experiment. He believed that by pushing people to the edge of guilt and then granting forgiveness, he could bring them closer to God. But somewhere along the line, he started deciding who deserved to live to feel that forgiveness, and who didn't. He poisoned them with his own blend of herbs and tranquilizers, calling it the cup of mercy. In his notes, investigators found phrases like faith through death and release before redemption. During the trial, he sat quietly, hands folded, sometimes smiling faintly as witnesses cried. He never denied killing them. He called it sacramental sacrifice. When the verdict came, guilty on 3 counts of murder, 26 counts of extortion and financial fraud, he asked the judge for one final request, to deliver a closing prayer. Permission was granted. He stood, hands raised, and began to speak. His voice filled the courtroom. Lord, forgive them, for they see only death, not deliverance. Let them burn my body, but keep my words alive. The judge cut him off, but his followers, yes, there were still some, wept openly. He was sentenced to life without parole. In prison, he became a model inmate, started a Bible study group, baptized other prisoners, and wrote letters to former parishioners claiming he'd been crucified by the system. Within a year, hundreds of his online followers were calling for his release, citing spiritual persecution. Then 5 years later, another fire broke out, this time in the prison chapel. 2 inmates dead, both part of his Bible study group. In the ashes, investigators found a melted communion chalice and traces of the same poison used years earlier. Kell was gone. The cameras showed him entering the chapel minutes before the fire but never leaving. Some believe he died in the blaze. Others believe he escaped, aided by guards sympathetic to his message. The official record says deceased, but his body was never found. Months later, recordings started appearing online. New sermons, same voice. Preaching forgiveness through surrender. One video showed a dimly lit room, a simple wooden cross, and the shadow of a man speaking softly. Redemption isn't bound by walls. The circle continues. The clip was traced to an anonymous server, location unknown, and though authorities shut down the channel, new ones kept appearing. Each signed the same way. Reverend J.K. Even now, people in Haverly say they still hear the church bells ringing sometimes at night, even though the steeple was never rebuilt. And when they do, they lock their doors. Because in the silence that follows, it almost sounds like someone whispering through the smoke, "You are forgiven." He called himself the shepherd of the floodplain. The town of Millwater had always lived by the river, and the river always rose. Every few years it clawed at the foundations of the church like an animal testing its cage. But when the Reverend Jonah Kell appeared, young, magnetic, with a voice that could make thunder sound polite, the town believed the floods had finally met their match. He came barefoot to his first sermon. The floorboards creaked beneath him as he spoke of humility and soil, of God as a current that carried the faithful where they must go. People wept. They dropped their coins into the offering box before he even asked. The old pastor resigned a week later, and the board of deacons quietly disbanded. Millwater Baptist became the River's Grace Tabernacle, and Jonah became the only authority that mattered. In the beginning, his miracles were small. A dying crop that revived after prayer, a widow who found her lost wedding ring in the offering plate. But stories once born feed themselves. By winter, people came from 3 counties away to hear the shepherd speak. He baptized dozens in the icy river. The flood cleanses, he told them, his breath fogging in the cold. Only the drowning are reborn. No one noticed that the collection plates grew heavier or that the church began buying properties. An old motel by the highway, a farmhouse up the ridge. He called them sanctuaries. He called them places of renewal. He said the world was ending soon, and his followers nodded, whispering of prophecies, of water and wrath. Then came the night of the drowning. Deputy Clara Moore remembered the call. "Possible mass suicide," the dispatcher said. The old mill road was slick with rain, the sky a bruised color. The farmhouse lights flickered like candles in a crypt. Inside, the smell hit her first, chlorine, wet wool, and something metallic. The living room had been stripped of furniture. In its center stood a round pool, dug into the floorboards, lined with blue tarp. Dozens of white robes floated on the surface. Some held bodies, others were empty. Clara counted 21 people before she found the first survivor, a boy of 16, coughing river water. He kept whispering. He said it would only hurt a moment. He said we'd wake in the current. Jonah Kell was not among them. For weeks, investigators combed the wreckage of the shepherd's empire. What they found was stranger than myth. Each property he'd bought had been converted into some form of isolation chamber. At the motel, rooms with scripture painted over the windows. At the Ridge House, a basement lined with speakers that played his recorded sermons on loop. The bank accounts linked to the River's Grace had moved millions of dollars. Donations, inheritances, pensions, all funneled into a trust registered in Belize. The trust's beneficiary was listed simply as the Ark. Clara went over every file, every photograph. The survivors refused to talk. When she finally tracked down one of the church's accountants, the woman's hands shook as she lit a cigarette. "He told us money was sin," the woman said. "He said the only way to purge it was to give it to him. He promised he'd cast it into the sea." The manhunt for Jonah Kell lasted 6 months. Posters with his face, half preacher, half prophet, appeared in every gas station in 3 states. Rumors placed him in New Orleans, in Baja, in a commune outside Tulsa. Some said he'd drowned himself in the same river he preached beside. Others swore they'd seen him on TV, clean-shaven, leading a new congregation under a different name. But it was an anonymous letter that finally broke the case. It arrived at the FBI field office in St. Louis, a single sheet of paper, smudged with dirt. "You'll find your shepherd where the water runs backward." They found him 2 days later in an abandoned water treatment plant 40 miles from Millwater. He was baptizing himself in a rusted filtration tank. When agents surrounded him, he smiled. "You're late," he said. The flood already came. At trial, the details sickened even the faithful. Testimony revealed that the drownings had been a ritual rehearsal Jonah had conducted before. The followers believed they'd emerge moments later, washed into light. He used sedatives disguised as holy water. Those who survived had been placed under his control for years, working on his properties, surrendering their wills piece by piece. When asked why he'd done it, Jonah gave the same answer each time. Because they begged me to. His defense team tried to plead insanity. The prosecution called it orchestrated murder under religious pretense. He was convicted on 21 counts of manslaughter, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The media called him the drowning pastor. In prison, Jonah became an enigma. Other inmates said he spent hours sitting under the communal shower, letting the water pour over him, whispering sermons to the drain. Guards found letters in his cell addressed to no one, pages filled with scriptural verses rearranged into riddles. One simply read, "The river never ends. Only its witnesses drown." Years passed. Millwater tried to move on, but the river never stopped rising. Each spring, the old church flooded again, soaking the hymnals, warping the pews. Locals swore they heard voices beneath the water when it reached the pulpit. Clara retired early. She kept one photograph pinned above her kitchen sink. The boy who'd survived, now grown, smiling in a college graduation gown. He'd changed his name, moved states. But sometimes he sent her letters. They always began the same way. "I still dream of the current." The last one arrived on a rainy Thursday. I think I understand now what he meant. The flood was never about water. It was about forgetting. She read it twice, then noticed the postmark. Millwater. She drove there the next morning. The church was gone, washed away by the latest flood. Only the foundation remained, half buried in mud, and in the middle of it, a single wooden cross, waterlogged, carved with words nearly erased by rain. "The river remembers." No one knows how it got there. Some say the boy returned and left it as a memorial. Others whisper that Jonah escaped his cell and came home one last time. What remains certain is this: every year, when the floodwaters rise over Millwater, the townsfolk hear a voice on the wind, a voice like thunder trying to pray. And somewhere beneath that dark water, a preacher keeps baptizing the dead. They said he could stop time. Not literally, of course. Not until the people of Westport started believing he could. The Reverend Tobias Grange wasn't the kind of man you'd forget. 6'5", silver hair slicked back like a serpent's skin, voice warm enough to melt your resolve. He preached under a clock tower that hadn't ticked in 20 years. The old Baptist church was dying before he came. Then somehow he made it holy again. He told them that every broken clock was a reminder that God had frozen time the moment you lost your faith, and he alone could make it move again. They laughed at first. Then they stopped laughing. Because when Tobias Grange touched that rusted clock face and whispered his prayer, the bell rang. Once. No one saw him pull the rope hidden in the rafters. But from that moment, people swore miracles began to happen in Westport. He started with the dying. A woman with lung cancer said she'd gone for a checkup and the doctor couldn't find the tumor. A man whose wife had been in a coma claimed Tobias prayed over her, and she opened her eyes. The town newspaper, starved for good news, ran a headline: "The clock that brought back faith." By autumn, Westport was full of pilgrims. They camped on sidewalks, slept in cars, filled donation jars until they overflowed. The Reverend didn't ask for money, at least not at first. He only asked for obedience. "Time," he said, standing beneath that silent bell, "is a debt we owe to the Creator. Every second you waste is a theft from eternity. I can help you pay it back." He called it the ministry of the hour. Every follower had to wear a small brass clock around their neck. Each clock had no hands, only a glass face etched with Tobias's initials, TG. They were to carry it everywhere. "Your time belongs to God now," he said, "and God keeps it through me." Behind the facade of devotion, something darker ticked. It began with the donations of time. He told his congregation that God could rewrite their destinies, but only if they gave him what he called chronal offerings. The ritual was strange. Followers wrote down the years they regretted, bad marriages, addictions, lost jobs, on slips of paper, then placed them into a brass box at the altar. Tobias burned the papers, whispering prayers as the smoke rose like the ghost of wasted time. The offerings grew more elaborate. People began surrendering their retirement funds. One woman sold her home and donated every penny, saying Tobias had promised she'd wake up young again when the clock moved next. She was found a month later living in her car behind the church, clutching a broken timepiece. He told them not to worry. "Time bends for the faithful," he said. "You'll understand when the hour comes." Detective Samuel Riker first heard of Tobias when the complaints started piling up. Missing persons, financial ruin, families torn apart. But every time Riker tried to question a parishioner, they only smiled, glassy-eyed. "We've stopped counting the days," they said. "The prophet's keeping them for us." Then, one January morning, a local farmer walked into the sheriff's office carrying a brass box he'd found in the woods. Inside were ashes, melted glass, and fragments of burned metal. Clock gears fused to human teeth. That's when they got the warrant. The raid on the Ministry of the Hour took place during a midnight service. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rattled the church spire. As officers burst through the doors, they saw hundreds of followers kneeling in perfect stillness, eyes closed, hands clasped around those clock pendants. On the altar, Tobias Grange stood with his arms outstretched, haloed by candlelight. In front of him sat a massive wooden contraption, a wheel of gears and chains connected to the old tower clock by iron rods. At its base were jars filled with what looked like human hair, labeled with names and dates. When Riker ordered him to step down, Tobias didn't move. He smiled and said, "You can't arrest eternity." Then he pulled a lever. The bell rang 12 times. Each strike felt like it shook the building apart. The congregation screamed, clutching their chests. Several collapsed. One woman's pacemaker shorted from the shock. In the confusion, Tobias fled through a side passage leading to the basement. They found him there minutes later, in a hidden room filled with hundreds of stopped clocks, all set to the same time, 11:59. The truth unraveled slowly, in testimony and tape recordings. Tobias Grange had once been a stage magician. Years before his ministry, he'd performed under the name The Timekeeper, specializing in illusions that involved freezing watches, reversing clocks, predicting hours on random timepieces. He was arrested in 2002 for conning elderly audiences into temporal investments, schemes where he promised to buy back lost years for a fee. He reinvented himself after prison as a preacher, moving from tent revivals to small-town churches, always promising one thing: control over time itself. In Westport, he'd perfected the con. He wired the church tower to respond to hidden levers, filled his sermons with references to the coming hour, and secretly recorded his followers' confessions. When they later claimed miracles, he used those recordings to manipulate their trust. The burned brass box in the woods contained more than teeth. It held fragments of dentures he'd kept as relics of renewal. The human hair belonged to his followers, collected during baptisms. Each jar represented a life he claimed to have reset. The trial was a circus. Reporters called him the prophet of the broken clock. Psychologists debated whether he was delusional or purely calculating. But when Tobias took the stand, he gave the jury something else: a sermon. He looked at them, eyes glittering, and said, "Every one of you is already dead. You're just waiting for your second hand to fall. I gave them mercy. I stopped their time before the world could waste it." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed shaken. He was sentenced to 120 years without parole for fraud, abuse, and the deaths of 3 parishioners whose medical devices had failed during his midnight hour service. But prison didn't stop him. It gave him a new pulpit. He began preaching to inmates. They called him Father Clock. He'd sit in the yard at sunrise, whispering to anyone who'd listen. "Time moves different here," he'd say. "God's hourglass has more sand on your side than mine." When guards searched his cell, they found drawings on the walls, hundreds of clock faces, each frozen at a different time. In the center, one phrase repeated like a mantra: "The 13th hour is near." After his 3rd year in confinement, strange reports emerged. Several inmates refused to sleep, claiming Tobias had told them the world would pause at midnight soon. When the power went out during a storm, and the prison's clocks stopped for exactly 60 seconds, panic spread. Tobias smiled through the bars and whispered, "See? He's coming." The warden ordered him transferred to a psychiatric facility. But the night before his move, Tobias vanished. Security cameras glitched at 11:59 p.m. Every feed froze for 60 seconds. When they came back on, his cell was empty. The guards swore they hadn't seen a thing. The official report said he escaped through the drainage tunnel during the blackout. But others whispered that maybe, just maybe, the prophet had finally stopped time after all. Years later, Detective Riker retired. He kept one souvenir from the case, a brass clock pendant, no hands, initials TG. It sat on his desk, paperweight and reminder of the madness he'd seen. Sometimes it caught the light and glimmered faintly, as though something moved behind the glass. One night, while closing a box of old files, he noticed it. The clock had changed. Tiny black hands had appeared on the face, pointing to 11:59. He thought it was a trick of the light, but when he blinked, the second hand twitched. Once. He heard a faint ticking, soft as breath. He smashed the pendant with a hammer. The ticking stopped. He told himself it was stress, imagination, echoes of an old case he couldn't let go of. But sometimes, when he woke in the middle of the night, he swore he could hear it again. Somewhere in the walls, in the heartbeat of the house, in the way silence stretches just before the hour turns. The clock tower in Westport still stands. Its hands haven't moved in years, but on certain stormy nights, locals say the bell rings once, though no one's inside. And if you stand close enough to the church gate, you can hear a whisper under the rain. The 13th hour has begun. They called her Mother Dorian. In the small desert town of Calvarus Springs, the heat never broke. It clung to the skin, filled the air with the smell of dry earth and oil from the nearby refinery. And in the center of it all stood her church, the House of Infinite Grace, a sprawling compound of white trailers, gold-painted fences, and banners that fluttered with words like "Mercy is wealth" and "The Lord rewards those who build." When she first arrived, no one knew who she was. She said she'd come from the mountains of Arizona, guided by a vision of a fountain of mercy buried beneath the desert. She wore long robes that shimmered like heat mirages and carried a book bound in red leather, handwritten, she claimed, by angels. Within a year, the town belonged to her. It started small, prayer meetings in motel rooms, healing circles in abandoned lots. But word spread quickly. People said she could cure pain with her touch, that she could see your sin before you spoke it. The oil workers came first, then their wives, then their children. By the second summer, her congregation numbered over 500. Every Sunday she preached under the relentless sun, her arms outstretched. "The world is dying," she said, "but the Lord has buried his heart here. And those who help me dig it up will never want again." No one ever questioned what that meant until she started the Mercy Project. She claimed the desert held divine power, and she was chosen to uncover it. She convinced followers to donate their land, their tools, even their savings, to build the well of heaven. The work began at dawn and lasted until midnight. They dug deep into the salt flats miles from the highway, under her supervision. She said she was unearthing a living spring that would heal the world. But the well never appeared, only more holes and more money. She called them offerings of soil. By the third year, her control had deepened. Every follower had to sign what she called a covenant of purity, a binding document that gave her authority over their finances and living arrangements. Couples were separated and reassigned spiritual partners. Children were placed in communal homes she called nests. One young mother, Carla Mendez, tried to leave. She said she'd seen something in the underground chambers, something that didn't look like a well. She packed her car at night and drove toward the highway, but the next morning her vehicle was found overturned in a ravine. The sheriff called it an accident. Mother Dorian said it was divine punishment. She broke the covenant, she told the congregation. The Lord collects his debt. It was around that time that a journalist named Elias Ward arrived from Phoenix. He was writing a piece on desert cults and faith-based frauds. The first time he attended one of her sermons, he wrote in his notes, "Magnetism, like watching a storm gather shape." She saw him in the crowd, smiled, and said, "There's a doubter among us. Let him stay. The Lord loves to make skeptics kneel." Over the next few weeks, he attended every gathering, watched as her followers chanted in unison, eyes glazed, faces streaked with dust and tears. He began to see the patterns, the exhaustion, the fear, the rehearsed testimonies. He noticed that no one seemed to work regular jobs anymore. Everything revolved around the house, and one night he followed them. He saw the convoys of pickup trucks heading into the desert. He saw them carrying heavy drums and digging deep trenches. And he saw from a distance the thing they called the well. It wasn't a well at all. It was a bunker, a massive underground vault with concrete walls, built from money that was supposed to fund the church's charity work. Inside were shelves of canned food, weapons, and gold bars stamped with foreign markings. The Fountain of Mercy was a survival shelter. Mother Dorian wasn't saving her flock. She was preparing for something else, or perhaps just herself. When Eli tried to confront her, she smiled that same desert-smooth smile. "You think I'm stealing from them?" she said. "I'm saving them from what's coming." "What's coming?" he asked. "The silence," she whispered. "The day when no one hears his voice anymore." That night, his motel room was ransacked. His car was found abandoned 15 miles away, keys still in the ignition. He disappeared without a trace. The official investigation began months later, when one of the followers, a teenager named Riley Hobbs, was found wandering barefoot near the interstate, dehydrated and muttering about voices in the pit. When police raided the compound, they found almost nothing. The trailers were empty, the fields abandoned, except for the main hall. In the center of the chapel, surrounded by rows of overturned chairs, was a massive wooden cross. At its base lay Mother Dorian's red leather book. Every page had been torn out. On the walls, scrawled in ash, were 3 words: "The fountain runs backward." What happened next is still debated. Some say the followers went underground, literally, that the bunker Elias Ward discovered was deeper than anyone knew. Others believe they scattered across the country, living quietly, waiting for her to return. A few months later, in a remote part of Nevada, a camera crew filming a commercial found something buried in the sand. A half-exposed statue of a woman carved in pale stone, her hands cupped as if holding water. On the base were faintly etched letters, MD. When investigators returned to Calvera Springs, they found fresh tire tracks near one of the old digging sites, and a new brass plaque had been nailed to the church door. It read, "Time is a thief. Grace is the lock." The sheriff ordered it removed. That night, the church burned to the ground. No one was ever arrested. Years later, a documentary crew tracked down some of her surviving followers. Most refused to talk. One woman, her voice trembling, said only this. She said we were the seeds, that when the world cracked open, we'd be the ones who bloomed first. She said she'd go down to wake the fountain, and when we heard thunder without rain, we'd know she was back. The interviewer asked when she'd last heard thunder in Calvera Springs. The woman smiled. "Last week," she whispered, and the sky was clear. Months after that interview aired, an anonymous envelope arrived at the network's office in Phoenix. Inside was a single photograph, an image of the desert at night under a full moon. In the distance, half buried in sand, was the entrance to a vault, and standing at its mouth was a figure in white robes, arms lifted toward the sky. On the back of the photo, in looping red ink, were 4 words: "Mercy keeps its promise." The house of infinite grace is gone now. The land has been fenced off, designated as private property owned by a shell corporation no one can trace. But truckers passing through that stretch of highway say sometimes they see lights moving across the flats, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. And at dawn, when the sun catches the dunes just right, they say the sand shimmers, as if something beneath it is still moving. And in the still air, faint and hollow, like wind through a dry well, comes a voice that sounds almost human. The fountain's almost full. They called him Brother Silas, but he preferred another name, the Shepherd. He said it softly, with the conviction of a man who'd earned it. His followers repeated it like prayer. The Shepherd knows. The Shepherd provides. The Shepherd sees the wolves, and when he smiled, they believed it. The church he built in the Pine Valley of northern Oregon wasn't grand, just a repurposed barn, a few cabins, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Haven of the Fold." But to the 200 people who'd left their lives behind to live there, it was paradise. They'd come from everywhere: Seattle, Denver, Boise, people who had lost faith in the world, in their families, in themselves, and Silas had found them one by one, on message boards, in prayer chat rooms, in the lonely corners of late-night radio shows. He had a voice that didn't just comfort, it restored. He told them the modern church had been poisoned, that he had seen the light of a purer way, not of cities or money or hierarchy, but of obedience. Faith, he said, is a flock, and every flock needs a shepherd. The compound looked humble, almost beautiful from afar. Rows of vegetable gardens, wooden crosses carved by hand, children running barefoot through the pine needles. Every Sunday they gathered in the barn, candles flickering, and sang hymns Silas wrote himself. But the deeper you went into Haven, the more the rules changed. At first it was little things. Surrender your phone, your wallet, your keys. Distractions, he called them. Then no visitors without permission. Then restricted food rations, fasting for purity. Then silence after sundown. He said the world outside was ending, that God had whispered to him through the trees, that soon fire would fall from the sky and only the fold would survive. And they believed him. Among his followers was Abigail Dean, a single mother who'd lost her husband to addiction. She joined seeking peace, a quiet place to raise her daughter, Nora. Silas called her the chosen mother. He said Nora would be the first of the new generation, a child of renewal. At first, Abigail felt hope. Nora smiled again. They grew vegetables, sang together, prayed under the stars. But one night she heard something strange. The sound of crying, muffled, coming from the main cabin where Silas lived. She went to check, but 2 men stood guard outside. When she asked why, they said, "The shepherd is cleansing the unfaithful." Later she saw one of the teenage boys, Eli, limping across the field, his back bandaged. He said he'd lost the rhythm of obedience. Silas had restored it with the belt of the word. The rituals escalated. Every month he gathered them for what he called the night of binding. Each follower had to kneel in a circle, confess their sins, and let Silas mark them. He used oil and ashes, but the ashes came from something he never explained. Some said it smelled like burnt fabric. Others thought it smelled like hair. He told them, only through pain can the soul find its pasture. He spoke often about wolves, those who questioned him, those who doubted. Doubt, he said, was the devil's whisper. If you hear it, you cut out the tongue. When one man, Henry Cobb, tried to leave, Silas gathered the fold and said Henry had been infected by the world. The next morning, Henry's car was found at the bottom of a ravine. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Silas called it divine pruning. Detective Laura Hayes first heard of Haven after a missing person report. A woman named Angela Pierce, who'd joined the fold 6 months earlier. Her family hadn't heard from her since. Laura drove up the narrow mountain road deep into the trees. At the gate, a man with a beard down to his chest stopped her. "The shepherd doesn't allow strangers," he said. She flashed her badge. "Then the shepherd can explain why 6 people from 3 states stopped existing after joining your church." He hesitated. Then he said, "He's expecting you." Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and candle wax. The congregation watched her with wide, cautious eyes. Brother Silas greeted her like an old friend. "You've come to the fold," he said softly. "Are you lost, detective?" "Just looking for a woman," she said. "Angela Pierce. You know her?" He nodded. "Of course. Sister Angela went into the forest to pray. Some people never want to come back from prayer." "That's not an answer," Laura said. He smiled. "It's the only one that matters." He invited her to dinner. The food was plain: beans, bread, water. The people ate in silence, heads bowed. Every time someone finished a bowl, they whispered, "He provides." That night, she stayed in her car by the gate, watching. Around midnight, she saw torches flickering near the barn. She followed them on foot. Through the slats of the wood, she saw Silas standing before his congregation. Angela Pierce knelt before him, crying. He lifted a silver chain. "You wanted to run," he said, "but the fold needs you whole." Then he placed the chain around her neck, pulled it tight, and whispered something into her ear. She stopped struggling. Her body went still. The congregation began to sing. Laura radioed for backup, but the signal was dead. When she kicked the barn door open, the candles went out, as if the air itself had obeyed him. Silas turned slowly. His face was calm. "You shouldn't be here," he said. She arrested him on the spot. The aftermath was chaos. Officers searched the grounds for days. They found shallow graves behind the cabin, 7 in total. Each body was wrapped in white linen, faces covered with carved wooden masks of sheep. Silas refused to speak at first. Then, during interrogation, he smiled and said, "You think you freed them? They were never yours to keep." In his journal, investigators found drawings, flocks of faceless figures, a single shepherd standing on a hill, arms outstretched. Beneath each drawing, a time was written, 4:44. He told them that was the hour of awakening. When asked what it meant, he said, "The clock hasn't struck yet." At trial, the courtroom was full. Survivors filled the benches, their faces blank, as if their minds were still caught in his spell. Silas represented himself. He wore plain prison clothes, but his voice still carried the power of the pulpit. "You call me a monster," he said, "but I only gave them what they begged for: order." The world out there is chaos. Here they were safe. One juror wept. Another crossed himself. When the prosecutor played a recording recovered from the barn, hymns mixed with screams, even the judge turned pale. He was found guilty on all counts: murder, unlawful imprisonment, fraud, and coercion. The sentence: life without parole. But even in prison, the fool didn't die. A year later, prison guards found strange carvings on the walls of his cell. Sheep drawn in ash and soap, always facing the same direction, toward the door. One morning, a guard opened the cell to deliver breakfast and froze. Silas was kneeling on the floor, eyes open, unmoving. Around him were 12 small piles of salt. On the wall, written in blood, were the words, "The flock will find me." Months later, a forest fire swept through the hills of northern Oregon. When rescue teams passed the ruins of the Haven compound, they found something untouched by flame: the barn's foundation, and buried beneath it, a stone tablet. On it was carved a verse: "When the shepherd falls, the sheep return to the field." Authorities dismissed it as a remnant of his delusions. But in the months after, there were reports from nearby towns, strangers showing up at churches, asking for the new fold, leaving donations marked 444. None stayed long. And when investigators tried to track the names on the donation slips, they found something impossible. Most belonged to people long presumed dead. To this day, locals say that when the wind moves through the pines, it sounds like voices singing, faint, wordless, but in perfect harmony. They say if you drive up that road at 4:44 a.m., you'll see lights in the trees. And if you stop, roll down your window and listen closely, you might hear a voice whisper from somewhere in the dark. The shepherd still watches. If this story gripped you, if the quiet horror behind the pulpit left you uneasy, then you'll want to see how much darker the next chapter goes. Subscribe now to uncover more real stories of faith, corruption, and downfall, where the line between preacher and predator disappears. Turn on all notifications so you don't miss the next shocking case in preachers, power, and prison, the hidden crimes of faith leaders. Because sometimes, the most dangerous place to hide is behind the cross.